In this section, we'll look at Nixon's record on the environment. And in the environmental section record alone, you can kind of see the drift from more moderation to conservatism I'd mentioned in the broader domestic policy. Environmental policy, Nixon began very pro-environment because the public was really behind it. On April 22nd, 1970, there was the first Earth Day, which was a massive demonstration of people calling for anti-pollution and protections of environmental quality. Students on college campuses around the country had been holding self-described teach-ins in opposition to the war, and they do things like boycott classes and get together for lectures and discussions. Well, Wisconsin Democratic Senator Gaylord Nelson first proposed a national teach-in on the environment, and the idea really just took off. In the end, approximately 20 million Americans took part. It involved 10,000 schools and 2,000 colleges and universities, and television devoted the entire coverage of the day to the environment. Protests or celebrations were held around the country, and there was including some theatrics like people wearing gas masks to highlight air pollution. They buried an internal combustion engine, for example. In New York, over 100,000 people gathered on Union Square, and a similar number gathered on the Mall in Washington, and Congress shut down for the day. It was really just a huge sign that to the politicians that the people wanted them to protect the environment. Nixon, again, didn't have any real strong ideological feeling or care for the environment, but he recognized this massive push for this, how popular this push for environmental legislation was. But he had some competition. The Democrats were led by Maine Senator Edmund Muskie, who had a strong record on the environment, and most people thought he'd be the Democratic candidate in 1972. So Nixon is going to try to preempt Muskie and sort of take the issue from the Democrats and make it his own and win all that support. That was his motivation for his pro-environmental stance initially. As if a exclamation mark on the public demand for environmental protection, just over a week after Nixon's inauguration in 1969, there was the infamous Santa Barbara oil spill in California. Santa Barbara had beautiful beaches, but oil rigs were in the Pacific just off the coast, and they were leaking. And soon these beautiful beaches were covered with nasty black slick oil. And dead wildlife was floating up, and housewives were crying as they tried to wash the gunk off the animals. And it all made for great TV and had large ratings. It eventually caused the government to close most of the oil drilling off the California coast. Now, some people have cited Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's book during the Kennedy administration, as the beginning of modern environmentalism. But a lot of people say the Santa Barbara oil spill was the real beginning. But, for Nixon, it just meant that, yeah, he had to go and advocate for environmental protection if he was going to win that vote that was going to Muskie. So what Nixon did was he signed the National Environmental Policy Act, often known by its acronym NEPA, on January 1st, 1970, sort of symbolic of a new decade. It was a bill that had been proposed by the Democrats, but by signing it, Nixon claimed it as one of his own. It stated unequivocally that it was the federal government's policy to protect environmental quality. The bill also created an advisory council in the White House called the Council of Environmental Quality, CEQ, and it mandated that every federal project of any significance had to have an environmental impact statement. It didn't say that the statement had to approve it. It just said there had to be an adequate environmental impact statement study of the environmental impact of whatever was proposed submitted to the CEQ. And in later years, as we'll see, the environmental groups found that they could file a lawsuit saying that the environmental impact statement was not adequate and thus slow down some of the more controversial projects. With Democrats proposing to unite some of the pollution fighting agencies that existed throughout government, Nixon signed on and signed a bill creating the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, which combined all the pollution fighting agencies into one. One of the more important bills that Nixon signed was the Air Pollution Control Act amendments in 1970, and it strengthened earlier law by requiring emission testings on mass-produced cars in use and not just on one prototype. Companies were making one prototype and saying, look, it passes, it's not polluting, but then on their mass-produced cars it wouldn't be the same. They can't do that anymore. It created emission standards for specific stationary sources of pollution such as factories, and it tightened federal ambient standards for the general overall quality of the air. Moreover, Nixon canceled the pesticide DDT and got through Congress a system for federal registration and possible cancellation of dangerous pesticides. DDT, by the way, was helping to kill off the bald eagle, which was becoming endangered. And of course, the bald eagle was a symbol of the national symbol of the United States. Environmentalists cited a number of major reclamation projects as damaging the environment. For example, there was the Cross Florida Barge Canal to connect the Gulf of Mexico with the Atlantic Ocean in northern Florida, but it cut through some environmentally sensitive areas. And the Miami Jetport was sort of coming out from Miami into the Everglades. And although construction had begun on both these, with environmentalists complaining, Nixon actually canceled them, just trying to win the environmental vote. Nixon signed legislation strengthening the protections for endangered species, encouraging recycling and the sanitary disposal of solid waste. He signed legislation prohibiting ocean dumping and promoting coastal zone management, among many other environmental protections. It was quite an impressive list of legislation that Nixon signed early in his presidency. As the Nixon administration continued, however, Nixon began to realize that he couldn't win the environmental vote. The Democrats would always propose more, and Nixon was both worried about the budget and the growing anger from his natural conservative Republican base of business, which of course resisted the regulations he just signed. And with the growing energy crisis, which had been mentioned in another video section, Nixon had additional reason to back away from his earlier environmentalism. So the environment is an example of the broader domestic policy of Nixon becoming more conservative. In any event, as a result of all this, Nixon increasingly fought against the environmentalists he'd earlier courted. Now, a really good example of this is Nixon's unsuccessful veto of the Water Pollution Control Act of 1972. And like the Air Pollution Act, this law is going to strengthen existing federal law. The Water Pollution Control Act of 72 established federal control over the discharge of water pollutants from specific sources, like individual plants and pipes. It strengthened EPA's authority over the ambient water quality standards, the overall quality of the water, and it provided massive funds for the construction of waste treatment centers. Now, Nixon thought this was too much, and he tried to veto it. But the Congress, dominated by Democrats, overruled Nixon's veto. They overrode it, so the law became federal. The bill became federal law. Growing more conservative, Nixon increasingly cut funding for environmental regulations, and the EPA, again, the agency he'd earlier created, and you're going to see him fighting environmentalists. He supported the Alaskan oil pipeline, which went through some pristine wilderness in Alaska, and he promoted the production of the supersonic transport, a plane that broke the sun, it had a sonic boom, and caused a lot of noise pollution. All of this angered the environmentalists. But it's evidence of, again, Nixon backing away from his earlier moderation in domestic policy, in this case, the environment. This concludes a section on Nixon's environmental record.